Most people imagine the federal prison system as a single uniform machine: walls, bars, razor wire, and a standardized routine repeated across the country. In reality, it is closer to a tiered control network. The system is designed less as one kind of prison than as a graded architecture of risk, separating people by violence history, escape potential, medical needs, disciplinary record, and institutional management requirements. That distinction matters because the public image of prison is usually shaped by the most restrictive facilities. Supermax confinement, permanent lockdowns, and famous high-profile inmates dominate headlines and documentaries. But those institutions represent only one edge of a much broader structure. Much of the federal system operates through classification, movement, and administrative sorting, not simply through maximum force. Its real logic is organizational. Assign, contain, monitor, and manage according to assessed security needs. At the bottom of that hierarchy are prison camps with minimal barriers and a strong emphasis on work programs. Higher up are low security and medium security institutions where controls become progressively tighter through fencing, housing design, staffing, and movement restrictions. Above them sit the high security penitentiaries built for violent, escape-prone, or heavily supervised populations. Beyond even that is the administrative layer, where the system handles its most disruptive, medically complex, politically sensitive, or nationally significant inmates. What makes the federal model especially revealing is that every level reflects a different operational philosophy. One facility may be built around labor and routine. Another is organized around cell control, surveillance, and separation. Another functions almost like a secure hospital. So to understand federal imprisonment, the first question is not who is incarcerated. It is how the government sorts human beings into different security environments and what that reveals about the priorities of the state itself. And that entire structure begins with a deceptively simple foundation: classification. Before walls, towers, or lockdowns can matter, the system has to decide where a person fits inside the hierarchy. To understand how the federal prison system actually functions, the first place to look is not the cell block. It is the classification process. Before a person is assigned to a facility, the Bureau of Prisons has to convert a complex human profile into an administrative decision. What level of control is necessary? What level of freedom is acceptable? And what risks the institution is expected to absorb? That process is built around security scoring. Officials examine factors such as sentence length, history of violence, prior escapes or escape attempts, detainers, criminal history, age, and disciplinary background. Some of those variables are static. A long sentence or a serious prior conviction does not change quickly. Others are dynamic, especially once a person is already in custody, because institutional behavior can raise or lower the level of concern. The result is not simply a label, it is a placement logic. A lower score can point someone toward a minimum security camp or a low security institution. A higher score can move that person into medium or high security confinement, where architecture, staffing, and movement rules are much more restrictive. In practice, this means the federal system is constantly trying to match the individual to the facility rather than treating every prison as interchangeable. That match is never purely mathematical. Management variables can override the score. Medical needs, sex offender designation, gang affiliation, notoriety, protective concerns, mental health issues, or cooperation in other cases can all affect placement. In other words, the formal score creates a baseline, but the actual assignment reflects a wider administrative judgment about order, safety, and liability. This is why two inmates with similar convictions may end up in very different places. One may present low escape risk and stable institutional behavior. Another may require separation, monitoring, or specialized services. The federal system is not just punishing conduct, it is continuously sorting for control. And once classification determines where someone belongs, the next layer becomes visible: the security levels themselves, starting with the least restrictive institutions in the entire federal network. The phrase federal prison often suggests steel doors, armed towers, and tightly controlled movement. But the lowest level of the system looks very different. Minimum security federal prison camps are built around a basic assumption. Some inmates can be managed with limited physical barriers because the government considers them relatively low risk in terms of violence and escape. These camps typically have dormitory housing rather than individual cells. Perimeter security is minimal or in some cases effectively absent compared with traditional prisons. Staffing ratios are lighter, daily movement is less restrictive, and institutional life is organized heavily around work assignments. That design is not accidental. It reflects a management model based on routine, labor, and predictability rather than intense physical control. Many camps are located next to larger federal institutions or federal complexes where inmates can support food service, maintenance, landscaping, warehousing, or other operational functions. Others contribute to off-site labor details, including public works or facility support roles. The camp, in this sense, is not just a place of confinement. It is a labor and custody environment designed for inmates the system believes can function under looser supervision. That does not mean these institutions are casual or open. Inmates are still under federal custody, movement is still regulated, and discipline still matters. A walk away from a camp is treated as an escape, and misconduct can quickly result in transfer to a more secure institution. The low-barrier environment exists only because the classification system assumes compliance can be maintained without the same infrastructure used at higher levels. This model has practical value for the Bureau of Prisons. Camps cost less to operate, place fewer demands on hardened security architecture, and create a controlled workforce inside the federal system. They also illustrate a larger point. Security level is not just about punishment intensity. It is about how much institutional force the government believes it must apply to maintain order. But once officials decide that open dorms and light supervision are not enough, the system moves into a very different category of control: the low-security prison. Low-security federal prisons sit at an important midpoint in the system. They are still clearly prisons with controlled movement, fenced perimeters, and a more visible security presence than prison camps. But they are not yet built for the highest risk population. Their purpose is to contain inmates who require a stronger institutional framework without the intensive restrictions found at the upper end of the hierarchy. A low-security institution usually has double-fenced perimeters, more regimented schedules, and a higher staff-to-inmate presence than a camp. Housing often remains more open than in high-security facilities, but freedom of movement is narrower, and supervision is more constant. The design signals a shift in philosophy. At this level, the Bureau of Prisons is no longer relying mainly on trust and routine. It is adding physical barriers and tighter accountability to reduce both disorder and escape risk. The population reflects that adjustment. Many inmates in low-security prisons may have longer sentences, more serious offense profiles, or histories that make minimum security inappropriate. Some may simply score too high for a camp because of sentence length or prior record, even if they are not considered highly violent inside the institution. That is one of the system's defining mechanics. Placement is often driven as much by administrative risk indicators as by public assumptions about the crime itself. Operationally, low-security prisons depend on structure. Counts, job assignments, controlled housing, and scheduled movement create a predictable rhythm that helps staff manage large populations with fewer disruptions. The institution is designed to keep inmates active, observable, and separated enough to prevent the informal looseness of a camp from becoming a security problem. This level also shows how federal custody scales gradually rather than abruptly. The transition from camp to low security is not just a taller fence. It is a different management formula, one that blends labor, surveillance, and controlled routine into a tighter model of confinement. And once that model is no longer sufficient, the next step is where the federal system becomes more hardened in both architecture and daily control: the medium security prison. Medium security federal prisons are where the system's architecture becomes unmistakably correctional in the conventional sense. The fences are stronger, internal movement is tighter, staffing is heavier, and the population is more difficult to manage over long periods. If low-security prisons are built around controlled routine, medium-security institutions are built around the assumption that routine alone is not enough. Order has to be reinforced by hardened infrastructure. These facilities typically use reinforced perimeters, armed coverage, stricter housing controls, and more compartmentalized movement. Inmates are still moved through schedules, counts, and work assignments, but every layer is more regulated. Housing units are monitored more aggressively. Group movement is more limited. The prison is designed to reduce spontaneous contact, suppress disorder quickly, and create more physical separation between staff and inmates when necessary. The population at this level is also more volatile. Many inmates have longer records, more serious violence histories, gang affiliations, or institutional misconduct that make lower security placement too risky. Some may have entered federal custody at this level from the start. Others arrive after disciplinary problems, reclassification, or transfer from less restrictive institutions. Medium security, in that sense, often functions as both a destination and a correctional reset point inside the wider system. This is also where prison management becomes more dependent on intelligence inside the institution. Staff are not just monitoring counts and schedules. They are tracking affiliations, conflicts, contraband risks, and disciplinary patterns that can destabilize an entire unit. A medium security prison is less about simple containment and more about continuous anticipation, identifying problems before they spread across a population that is larger, denser, and harder to predict. That makes these institutions a crucial middle layer. They hold many inmates who are too risky for open environments, but do not yet require the most restrictive federal confinement. The system still aims to manage through structure, but now structure must be backed by force, surveillance, and rapid intervention. And when even that level of control is judged insufficient, the Bureau of Prisons moves into its most fortified standard environment, the high-security penitentiary. High-security federal prisons are the institutions most people picture when they hear the word penitentiary. This is the top end of the standard security ladder, built for inmates the government considers the hardest to manage in ordinary prison conditions. The design is blunt in its intent. Stronger barriers, more staff, more control points, and less room for improvisation by the population inside. These penitentiaries use heavily secured perimeters, close supervision, and housing arrangements meant to contain violence, suppress coordinated disorder, and limit escape opportunities. Movement is tightly scheduled. Counts are constant. Staff presence is more visible and more force-ready than at lower levels. The institution is engineered not just to confine, but to dominate the pace of daily life through architecture and procedure. The population reflects that mission. High-security facilities hold many inmates with serious violence histories, entrenched gang roles, major disciplinary problems, or escape concerns that make lower security settings unworkable. Some arrive directly because of offense severity or sentence profile. Others are transferred upward after repeated misconduct elsewhere. In either case, the prison is designed on the assumption that conflict is not an exception. It is a management condition that must be anticipated every day. That changes how staff operate. A high-security penitentiary relies on rapid response capability, constant intelligence gathering, and physical separation strategies to prevent one incident from expanding into a broader institutional crisis. Housing assignments, recreation schedules, transport procedures, and even meal movement are all shaped by that logic. Control is achieved by reducing unpredictability and maintaining the ability to isolate trouble quickly. Historically, this level became especially important as federal authorities took on more organized crime figures, violent repeat offenders, and inmates linked to prison gangs capable of exerting influence across institutions. The penitentiary became the place where the Bureau of Prisons concentrates the tools of conventional hard custody. But even the most fortified standard prison is not the end of the system. Some inmates cannot be managed through normal penitentiary operations at all, which is why the federal structure includes a separate category built for exceptional control, the administrative institutions. If the federal prison system were only a ladder from minimum to maximum security, it would be easier to understand. But it is not. Running alongside that ladder is a separate category known as administrative institutions, and these facilities exist because some inmates do not fit neatly into a normal security score. They may be too dangerous, too vulnerable, too medically complex, or too institutionally disruptive for the standard model to work. This category includes several very different environments under one administrative umbrella. Some institutions are designed for high-level control, including the federal Supermax system. Others specialize in medical treatment, mental health care, pretrial detention, transportation staging, or the secure management of inmates who need separation for reasons that have little to do with a standard violence score. In other words, administrative does not mean less restrictive. It means functionally specialized. That specialization reveals something important about how the federal system operates. Standard prisons are built around broad population management. Administrative institutions are built around exceptions. A person may be sent there because of severe medical needs, because they are awaiting court proceedings, because they are considered a national security concern, or because the Bureau of Prisons believes ordinary penitentiary routines cannot safely contain them. A federal medical center, for example, can operate partly like a hospital inside a correctional perimeter. A detention center near a major courthouse may exist primarily to hold inmates moving through the judicial process. And at the far end of the spectrum, a Supermax facility is designed for near total control through extreme separation, restricted movement, and intensive monitoring. These are not different points on the same continuum. They are different tools built for different institutional problems. This administrative layer gives the Bureau of Prisons flexibility. It allows the system to absorb cases that would otherwise overwhelm normal facilities or create unacceptable risks. It is where the federal government manages the outliers. And among those outliers, no institution is more closely associated with extreme control than the one designed to isolate the most difficult inmates in federal custody, the Supermax. To many viewers, the Supermax prison is the entire story of maximum federal custody. In reality, it is a very specific instrument. The federal Supermax, most closely associated with ADX Florence in Colorado, was built for inmates the Bureau of Prisons considers too dangerous, too disruptive, or too difficult to control in even a high-security penitentiary. Its purpose is not simply confinement. It is long-term incapacitation through isolation. The mechanics are stark. Inmates are typically housed alone. Movement is tightly choreographed and heavily restricted. Recreation, when permitted, is usually separated from the general population. Contact with other inmates is minimized, and the institution is designed to reduce opportunities for assault, coordination, or influence. The architecture itself is part of the control system: sealed environments, controlled sight lines, reinforced doors, and procedures that keep direct interaction to a minimum. This model grew out of a practical correctional problem. By the late 20th century, federal authorities faced inmates who could organize violence across prison populations, attack staff repeatedly, or continue directing criminal activity from behind bars. Traditional penitentiaries could punish and contain them, but not always neutralize their influence. The Supermax solution was to break the prison down into isolated units of one, separating the individual not only from the public, but from the institutional society of prison itself. That does not mean every inmate stays there permanently or for the same reason. Placement can reflect assaultive conduct, escape risk, gang leadership, terrorism-related concerns, or repeated inability to function in less restrictive settings. The point is administrative control, not symbolic severity. The federal system uses the Supermax as a last resort environment for those it believes cannot be safely managed through ordinary high-security operations. This makes Supermax confinement less a separate world than the outer limit of one central principle. Reduce uncertainty by reducing contact, but isolation alone cannot run a prison system. To sustain every level below it, the Bureau of Prisons also depends on another layer of control that is less visible, but just as decisive: staffing, training, and internal discipline. Security levels may define the architecture of federal prisons, but institutions do not run themselves. The real operating system is people: correctional officers, case managers, intelligence staff, medical personnel, psychologists, transport teams, and administrators who translate policy into daily control. To understand how a prison holds together, it is necessary to look at staffing and training, because the federal system depends as much on managed procedure as on walls and fences. At the front line are correctional officers. They conduct counts, supervise movement, respond to disturbances, search housing areas, and enforce routine compliance. But their job is broader than physical presence. Officers also become the institution's first warning system. They notice changes in behavior, tension between groups, shifts in routine, and early signs that a conflict may be building long before it becomes a formal incident. Around them is a wider administrative structure. Unit teams manage housing assignments, programming, and case files. Psychologists and medical staff handle mental health crises, treatment needs, and behavioral stability. Intelligence personnel track gang activity, contraband patterns, communication risks, and threats against staff or inmates. In other words, prison order is not maintained by force alone. It is maintained by information flowing through specialized roles. Training reflects that reality. Staff are prepared not just for emergencies, but for procedural consistency. Searches, escorts, counts, use of force responses, and reporting systems are all designed to reduce improvisation. A federal prison becomes more stable when every employee understands where authority begins, how incidents escalate, and what steps are required before a problem spreads. In that sense, discipline applies to staff as much as inmates. This structure becomes especially important during disturbances. A fight, a lockdown, or a contraband discovery can trigger coordinated responses involving custody staff, supervisors, medical teams, and intelligence review. The institution has to absorb the shock without losing command of the larger population. That is why staffing is more than labor. It is the human layer of institutional resilience. But even disciplined staff cannot control a prison blindly. To stay ahead of violence, escape plots, and organize influence, they need something more precise than presence: intelligence from inside the prison itself. Prisons are often described as places of confinement, but operationally they are also environments of constant information gathering. In the federal system, intelligence is what allows staff to look beyond the visible routine and detect the hidden structure inside the institution. Alliances, rivalries, contraband pipelines, escape planning, and the informal power networks that can shape daily life more than official rules do. This intelligence work is partly formal and partly observational. Staff collect incident reports, monitor disciplinary patterns, analyze mail and phone restrictions where permitted, track inmate associations, and review information from searches, interviews, and confidential sources. A weapon found in one housing unit or a sudden refusal to enter a common area may signal a deeper conflict that is still taking shape. The institution has to read these signals early because once violence becomes visible, control is already under strain. Gang management is one of the clearest examples. Prison gangs are not just loose groups of inmates. In some cases, they function like structured organizations with rules, hierarchies, and cross-facility influence. That means intelligence cannot stay local. Federal authorities may need to connect information from one prison to another, identify key intermediaries, and separate individuals whose communication could destabilize multiple institutions at once. Contraband follows the same logic. Phones, narcotics, improvised weapons, and unauthorized communications are not merely rule violations. They are tools that can alter power inside the prison. A contraband network can support debt, coercion, violence, and outside criminal coordination. So searches, mail controls, visiting procedures, and intelligence reviews are all part of one larger effort to prevent unofficial systems from overtaking the official one. This makes prison intelligence less about espionage than about institutional forecasting. The Bureau of Prisons is trying to anticipate pressure before it turns into disorder. It needs to know not just what happened, but what is likely to happen next. And that predictive function matters even more because federal prisons are not static populations. Inmates are constantly being moved, transferred, staged, and redistributed through a national logistical network. A federal prison sentence does not unfold in one place from start to finish. Behind the walls, the system is in constant motion. Inmates are transferred for security reasons, court appearances, medical treatment, disciplinary action, program participation, and population balancing. To understand how the Bureau of Prisons works nationally, it is necessary to see it not as a collection of isolated prisons, but as a transportation and distribution network moving people through different custody environments. That network serves a practical purpose. Classification can change. An inmate who behaves well may become eligible for a lower security placement. Another who commits serious misconduct may be transferred upward. A person with urgent health needs may be routed to a federal medical center. Someone facing new proceedings may be sent closer to a courthouse or detention center. The system remains flexible by keeping inmates mobile. Transport itself is heavily controlled. Movements are scheduled, documented, and coordinated across institutions, transportation hubs, and outside agencies. Some inmates travel over long distances to match bed space, security needs, or specialized services available only at certain facilities. This means placement is never just about where a person was sentenced. It is about where the federal system can manage that person most effectively at a given moment. The historical significance of this national network is easy to miss. A decentralized prison map could become unstable if each institution were forced to solve its own problems in isolation. Transfers give the diversity of prisons a way to relieve pressure, separate rivals, break up gang concentrations, protect vulnerable inmates, and reassign complex cases without redesigning entire prisons. Movement is one of the agency's most important management tools. This logistical layer also affects families, legal access, and institutional continuity. A transfer can change who an inmate lives near, what programs are available, and how easily outside contact can be maintained. The prison system, in that sense, is not only a structure of confinement, it is a structure of controlled movement. And once that movement is understood, the next question becomes broader. What exactly are these institutions trying to produce beyond security, and how do programs, work, and rehabilitation fit into that mission? Prisons are usually judged by their ability to confine, but the federal system is also built around a second question. What happens inside the sentence besides containment? That is where programming, labor, education, treatment, and incentives come in. These are not side features added for appearance. They are management tools designed to shape behavior, reduce institutional instability, and prepare at least some inmates for eventual release. The most visible layer is prison work. Across many federal institutions, inmates are assigned jobs that keep the prison functioning day to day: food service, maintenance, sanitation, laundry, and facility support. Work details create routine, occupied time, and reinforce a structured hierarchy of responsibility. In some settings, they also connect to larger production or service systems, turning labor into a practical component of prison administration. Alongside labor are formal programs. Educational courses, literacy instruction, vocational training, and substance abuse treatment are meant to address deficits that affect both institutional behavior and post-release stability. Some programs are tied to incentives, including potential benefits in housing, transfer opportunities, or sentence-related credits where authorized by law and policy. The federal approach is not purely therapeutic, it is transactional. Participation can improve an inmate's standing inside the system. This matters because idle populations are harder to manage. A prison with no structured activity gives informal power networks more room to grow. By contrast, a prison with programs, schedules, and measurable benchmarks can channel time into monitored routines. Even treatment programs serve a dual purpose. They may support rehabilitation, but they also support order by reducing volatility and giving staff another framework for evaluating progress. The limits are just as important as the goals. Not every inmate has equal access to programs. Security level, sentence length, institutional misconduct, facility resources, and transfer history all shape what is available. In high security or highly restrictive settings, the ideal of rehabilitation often yields to the immediate priority of control. That tension runs through the entire federal system. It is never only about punishment and never only about reform. It is about managing both at once. And that balance becomes most visible when the system faces its hardest test of all: re-entry, release, and the attempt to move people back out of prison without losing control of the process. For all its walls and procedures, the federal prison system is not designed to end at confinement. Most inmates will eventually leave custody, and that means the Bureau of Prisons has to manage one final transition: the controlled movement from prison back into society. This stage is often described as release, but operationally it is a risk management process. The goal is not simply to open the gate, it is to reduce the chances that instability inside prison becomes instability outside it. That process usually begins before the release date itself. Case managers track sentence calculations, good conduct time, program participation, disciplinary history, and release planning requirements. Inmates may be evaluated for transfer to less restrictive environments, such as residential reentry centers or home confinement, depending on legal eligibility, institutional behavior, and available placement capacity. These are not symbolic reward. They are graduated control environments meant to test responsibility under closer exposure to ordinary life. Residential reentry centers, sometimes called halfway houses, play a key logistical role. They allow inmates nearing release to work, rebuild community ties, seek housing, and reestablish basic routines while still remaining under structured supervision. Home confinement pushes that transition even further, shifting control from institutional space to monitored living arrangements. In both cases, the federal system is trying to avoid a hard break between total custody and total freedom. The strategic logic is clear. An inmate released directly from a tightly controlled prison into an unstructured, civilian environment may be less stable than one who passes through a staged reentry process. That is why release planning can involve employment preparation, identification documents, treatment continuity, transportation coordination, and communication with probation authorities. The prison system's role does not vanish on the release date. It hands the case forward into another layer of federal supervision. This is also where the limits of incarceration become visible. A prison can impose order internally, but it cannot guarantee what happens afterward. Re-entry exposes the gap between institutional control and social reality. The federal system can structure the exit, but it cannot fully control the world the former inmate is returning to. And that unresolved tension leads to the larger conclusion. What role does the federal prison system actually play in the broader machinery of the American state? And how is that role changing over time? In the public imagination, the federal prison system often appears as a blunt instrument, a place where the government sends convicted people and keeps them there. But the closer view reveals something more complex. It is a national management structure built to sort risk, allocate control, move populations, and maintain order across a wide range of custody environments. Its real function is not simply punishment. It is administrative containment on a national scale. Each layer of the system reflects that purpose. Classification translates personal history into institutional placement. Camps, low-security prisons, medium-security institutions, penitentiaries, medical centers, detention facilities, and Supermax units each solve a different control problem. Staffing, intelligence, transport, programming, and reentry are not separate side systems. They are the connective tissue that allows the larger machine to function without collapsing into disorder. That is why the federal prison system matters beyond the prison gate. It is part of the broader operational architecture of the American state, sitting at the intersection of courts, law enforcement, public health, and national security. It absorbs people produced by federal investigations, terrorism cases, organized crime prosecutions, drug trafficking networks, financial crime, immigration-related offenses, and many other streams of federal law. In doing so, it becomes a downstream institution for decisions made elsewhere in government. Its future challenges are likely to be less about a single dramatic crisis and more about pressure from multiple directions at once. Aging inmate populations increase medical demands. Mental health needs strain in institutions built primarily for custody. Staffing shortages can weaken routine control. New communication technologies create fresh contraband and intelligence problems. At the same time, public debate continues over sentencing, rehabilitation, and how much incarceration should be used at all. So the strategic reality is this. The federal prison system is not just a collection of cells. It is a continuously adjusted infrastructure for deciding how much control the government believes it must exercise over different categories of people. And as law, technology, and public expectations change, that infrastructure will keep adapting. because the central question never really disappears. It only gets asked in new forms. Who is considered manageable, under what conditions, and at what cost to the state that is doing the managing?